You're listening to part 3 of The Trickster, read by author Jason Lee Willis. Chapter 30, Promposals. Split Rock High School, February 13th, 1986. Love was in the air at Split Rock High School, so Levi McPherson kept his head down low and simply hid behind his long hair as he went about his day. After lunch, he was able to hide even better when he signed out from study hall to go to the library. Thank you, Albert Fisher. Levi McPherson leaned back from the microfiche machine, stunned by the technology he held at his fingertips. He looked around Split Rock High School Media Center to see who else lingered. While the spirit of Albert Fisher warned him about Omadai, a Fisher grant had given him the state-of-the-art facility that was Split Rock High School, which now allowed him to research the truth of what happened in Hiawatha County over the past 90 years. The Media Center was the central hub of the high school, with access doors on all four sides of the spacious library. It was Levi's 5th year of using the Media Center, but he'd never stepped into the small room with the big machines. Levi rolled back a few feet from the machine to a cabinet that held decades of scanned newspapers on thin plastic photographic sheets. He could read accounts from the Little Falls Herald, the St. Paul Globe, or the St. John North Star News. He no longer needed Lily to tell him what happened in 1898. Or another ghost. Despite the assurances of both Lily and Wally, Levi now had unbiased, unfiltered accounts, and after half an hour, his notebook was filled with names, dates, and anecdotes. He researched villains, Zero Gun, Halvar Dobie, Osius Haggard, Philip Marquette, and the paterfamilias, Scott Sinclair. He couldn't find any mention of archfiends Joseph Littletoad or Bushy Bill Morrison, but he did find a short obituary about Constable Gordon Graham being killed in the line of duty during the Indian uprising at Leech Lake. A lie. He was right about the Order of Eos. He also researched heroes: Farrell Looning, Arnie Forsberg, Liev Nielsen, Kermit Crane, Albert Fisher, and his great-grandfather, Jean Guerin, all members of Lily's Lodge of Guardians, the Men of the Knife, the Asante. All of the deaths Wally Crane spoke of were also confirmed, both in 1898 and 1962. The newspaper articles confirmed the facts, but not the circumstances. "Are you standing me up?" The voice had been so unexpected that Levi jumped, causing Lacey Morrison to chuckle at the doorway to the microfiche room. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." Levi hastily closed the notebook and shrugged. "Oh shit, it's Thursday. Oh man, I lost track of things. I'm really sorry. How long did you wait for me?" "I didn't wait. I found Garrett instead. Do you still want to practice?" Levi looked at his watch. There were 10 minutes remaining in the period, leaving him almost no time to get back down to the choir room and still have a meaningful practice with his accompanist. "Sorry, Lacey. We can run through it a few times next week. We've still got a lot of time before the competition." "That's what everybody says," Lacey said as she stepped into the room and sat down on the chair in front of the other microfiche machine. "You should have seen poor Garrett. I don't think he's practiced it once." "Yeah, he gets a little flush around girls, though. Not like you, lover boy? How are things working out with you and Jill O'Brien?" "How can I focus on a girlfriend when I'm about to battle monsters?" "Jill? Oh, please. Once she left the couch, that was over. Did you see what she did to my neck? I had to wear my sister's makeup to cover up the hickey." "Yes, I saw. I saw her giving you those hickeys." Levi felt a flutter go down his spine. Jill O'Brien had latched on to him at Lacey's party and didn't let go until she passed out watching a movie. But once he'd made her out with her on the couch, he had caught a glimpse of Lacey, curled up in her newest boyfriend's arms, glancing over at him with a wry smile. "I heard you broke up with Shane." "Good riddance, too. Have you ever seen his teeth up close? 2 words. Plaque buildup. Did you dump him for that other guy? What other guy? I visited the nursing home in St. John on Tuesday and saw you cozied up with a piano player while you two put on a show for the residents. Carson? Ew, he's like 30-something. I suppose you didn't see that. Oh, never mind. What were you doing at the nursing home? Why didn't you say hello? Oh, it's complicated. And with my great-grandmother nearing the end, I've been doing a lot of family research. I met with an old friend of the family, Wally Crane. Oh, he's such a sweetheart. He reads to Nancy every morning. Have you heard how they met? It's so romantic. Nancy found a gentleman like Wally, but I get creeps like Shane asking me to prom. So, are you doing anything fun for the weekend? Got a hot date? Levi glanced down at her knees and noticed a slight rise in the fabric as if she had knee pads under the denim. Then he saw a scab on her elbow and scrapes on her right palm. No. I'm going to avoid parties for a while. I almost got caught sneaking back into my house last time. I wish I was that wise when I was a sophomore. I'm just starting to learn that lesson. Levi felt like throwing up. He thought back on their encounter on Halloween and how she'd likely been sexually assaulted moments earlier. Lacey Morrison has her secrets. He cleared his throat and threw out fodder for a conversation. While I was reading, I came across some Morrisons. You don't say. Do you have a secret crush on me? Lacey flirted. No, I think Morrison County was named after your family. You don't say. Well, I looked into Morrison County history, which was named after William and Allen Morrison, fur traders and explorers. William was the first white man to ever visit the headwaters of the Mississippi, apparently, but here's where it gets complicated. After visiting Minnesota, he went to Calgary, which is where a local lawman named Bill Morrison came from. Bushy Bill? Big eyebrows, Levi explained, remembering them from the microfiche picture he'd seen earlier. Bushy Bill had an affair with a local woman named Adriana Sinclair. But before they could get married, he just vanished in 1898. But they had a kid whom she named Jack Morrison, who moved to Colorado. Great-Grandpa Jack? Wow. You really do have a thing for me, don't you? Lacey ignored all the facts and went right to the core of the matter. So is this how you flirt with girls? Bring up their family trees? Levi shook his head. Why am I telling her this? Sorry. Here I thought Reuben was the honor student and you were the dumb and handsome lover boy. You've got a lot going on upstairs, don't you? She studied him for a moment, making him look down at his own knees. I notice how your fashion has been evolving from LA glam to pre-Columbian. It's a cool look. I dig your shell necklace. Is that your way of connecting to your great-grandmother? I suppose it is. I like the hat you wore at the party. Okay, I've got a hypothetical situation for you, Levi. Let's say there's this senior girl who just broke up with her boyfriend right before prom, and she pretty much hates the rest of the guys in her class and the junior class. Unfortunately, she already bought a dress, but she kind of hates the whole idea of prom. Should she sell the dress and skip prom, or should she stoop so low as to ask an underclassman to prom? Oh shit, is she asking me to prom? Hypothetically? Hypothetically, what should she do? It depends. On what? Lacey toyed. If this hypothetical senior girl is hot, if she's hot, then she'll have no problem finding a new guy that's as cool as she is, instead of one that would make all of her friends roll their eyes. I don't care about my friends. Okay, yes, I think she should have no problem asking an underclassman to prom, but make sure it's the right one. Most sophomore guys would kill to be the date of this super hot hypothetical senior girl, but there might be one who is struggling with stuff right now. Stuff he can't talk about. If she asked this guy, he would want to say yes, but would tell her no for reasons she couldn't understand. Oh, really? Well, I guess that tells me all I need. Guess I'm selling the dress. Lacey stood up. Next week, you're going to be on time for your solo practice. There's a lot more than prom that you and I need to talk about. Lacey paused and looked down at her scuffed palm. I've also got a lot of stuff going on that I'm struggling with. His supposed mortal enemy, the descendant of Bushy Bill Morrison, gave a forced smile through eye glossed with tears. What the hell was that? Chapter 31, Jaga, Canarancy Creek, February 15th, 1986. The odds are in my favor, Brian Forsberg reminded himself as he strapped his pistol to his torso prior to his daily fight against the darkness. His 2 German shepherds, sensing that he was leaving the cabin for the day, nuzzled his palms. They followed him to the garage. He'd installed doggy doors, leaving both the kitchen and garage to give them free patrol of his property while he was away. Climbing into his Hiawatha County Sheriff's Department SUV, Forsberg sat for a moment in silent reflection. It was 3:30 a.m. Hiawatha County had 1,300 square miles to patrol, running 39 miles east to west and 30 miles north to south. Brian made a point to know each and every square mile since he returned to the county in the summer of 1972. As sheriff, he had an annual system of getting to know each and every square mile by driving different routes to work. For both political and protective reasons, he wanted each and every citizen to know that he knew where they lived. Brian turned the key and fired up the cold engine block. For the next 3 hours, he would not be sheriff. He would be Makwa, the bear. Gary and Frecky escorted him as if he was Odin himself from the garage and up the narrow driveway. Gary and Frecky were trained to patrol the property, and Brian's driveway made it nearly impossible for anyone to travel. Plus, the cattle gate at the end of the driveway kept vehicles at a formidable distance. Climbing out to unlock the gate, his shepherds waited attentively for the command. He pulled his SUV forward and reversed the process, but this time he barked out the words they wanted to hear. Jaga! Both dogs took off through the pines. The descendant of Viking Goths, Brian managed to learn new Swedish words each night, including the word jaga, the command to hunt. A few miles later, he approached Lake Manitou from the Aldrich Road, which still had old billboards advertising Carousel Park. He paused at the intersection of Old Copper Road. Straight ahead would take him to Chippewa Beach. A right-hand turn would take him to the familiar ruins of the old park. A left-hand turn would take him toward Sterling Junction. He took the path less traveled, right. 3 generations earlier, Martin Nielsen had cleared rocks from his fields to make a makeshift road through his 2 wheat fields. Each spring, after the frost had come out of the ground, Brian and Jimmy Nielsen filled a truck bed full of rocks that rose to the surface. Now his SUV followed the secret road between the Berg homestead and the Nielsen homestead. The Nielsens were all gone, but the road remained. His eyes were so focused on the vacant homestead that he almost didn't see the fresh tracks descending to the shore opposite of Turtle Island. He put the SUV into park and stepped out. Teens looking for a private place to party traveled in packs. He walked down the track of a single large vehicle. Even though it remained a possibility that a kid took his girlfriend to a secluded location for a night of sex, Brian reached inside of his jacket to draw out his Colt. Unlike his service revolver, the Colt had the kill impact of a Scottish broadsword. In 1980, the Nielsen children leased the entire property of the island to the Mesquite Island Lutheran Ministries of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, who hastily erected a bunch of cabins and a large building for worship. 6 years into the project, the Bible camp had become a growing presence on the lake during the summers. But no one went there during the winter. After cautiously crossing the bridge, which left him quite visible, Brian stepped out of the ruts and took the protection of the pines. His grip on the pistol tightened when he spotted a large passenger van in front of the mess hall. He watched for a few minutes. The power had not been turned on. The lights came from portable lanterns that were set on a table. At the van, he saw a set of footprints coming from the driver door and passenger door, and then a convergence of prints near the rear door. They carried something into the hall together. Or someone. He circled the hall, which had been boarded up against a cruel winter and trespassers, leaving only slivers of light between the plywood and the windows. When he returned to the front of the hall, he saw the 2x4 that had been screwed into the door and frame leaning against the wall. He slipped the revolver back into its holster and took hold of the 2x4 and, standing aside, used it to gently push open the door. After a moment, he set the board down and drew his pistol, and brazenly took several steps into the room. It wasn't textbook procedure, but his plans had nothing to do with protocols. Brian ignored the fact that a child was hanging by a rope from the ceiling. His eyes looked for motion. One predator stood still, while another, also wearing an ancient wooden mask, made a quick motion for a nearby table. Brian adjusted his aim, struck his target just below the knee, and sent him tumbling to the cement floor in sprays of blood as only a few tendons kept the lower leg attached to the rest of him. The echo of the Colt still reverberated in the empty hall by the time the metal sight focused on the center of the second mask. "Kneel!" Brian commanded as he saw the dragging-like exhalations coming from his own lungs in the frigid air. The first man began to holler in agony, but with his pistol still drawn on the second masked man, Forsberg moved swiftly to his victim. With his heavy leather boot, he stomped the man's face so hard that his head hit the frozen concrete with equal force, knocking him out. He followed the barrel of his pistol until he stood directly in front of the kneeling man. He didn't need to see the man's face yet. That would come later. Nor did he need to appraise the condition of the child. It had only taken a glance to know the vessels below the pale child collected almost every drop of blood from the ritualistic spear wound to his torso. A sacrifice to Odin, Forsberg knew, even if the gods the men served had names far more ancient than those the Vikings used. Along with the child, several other animals hung from the rafters of the mess hall, most likely brought to the scene in the storage van. "Face first on the ground," Brian next commanded, and the startled Eos priests obeyed. Brian almost read him his Miranda rights, but he knew neither man was going to walk in with him to the Hiawatha County Sheriff's Department today. Once the man was on the ground, Brian looked to his watch. 4:37 a.m. Plenty of time. Chapter 32, The Only Way. Old Copper Road, February 15th, 1986. Levi McPherson's dreams of a beautiful redhead groupie waiting for him backstage of an imagined concert turned to ash when he heard the angry cry of a raven. Fozzie's back. Perhaps I'll get another chance to listen to him. He pulled his pillow up over his head, but the sound of clawed feet upon the ridge of the roof made it impossible to ignore the agitated bird. So much for sleeping in on a Saturday. Slipping out of bed, he picked his clothes carefully for his date. No, it wasn't with the imaginary redhead, Maddie Sinclair, or even with Lacey Morrison. It was with Lily. She promised to teach him the last of what she'd been handed down to her by her own grandfather, Nana Conan. After that, they would go to prepare with the Asante Lodge. At the bottom of the first flight of stairs, Joey's window was tossed wide open, and the fresh snow of the roof had raven prints on it. Is he feeding it through the window? Joey hadn't crawled onto the roof, so Levi shut the window. He freshened up before following the smell of bacon and egg downstairs to the kitchen, where his mother lingered with her apron still on. "I was about to throw this out," Mom said after setting a plateful in front of him at the small kitchen table. He just started shoveling in the eggs to avoid talking, but then she slid into the chair opposite of him. She had a full cup of coffee, which meant she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "Plans for the day?" "I might run to Brainerd to pick up some new tapes." "Not Leech Lake?" He kept chewing, trying not to miss a beat. Instead of lying or avoiding, he twisted the conversation to, "Do you think the roads are good enough to get to Leech Lake?" She sighed. "I talked to Biff the other day, and he was under the impression that you've been visiting Grandma Lily quite often." He ignored the comment, since there wasn't a question. "Sheriff Forsberg and I go way back, and even if you weren't driving around in that hot rod of yours, he'd still let me know where my son was. Why are you spending so much time with her suddenly?" Levi took a bite of toast, just so he could answer with his mouth full. "She's interesting." "Oh, I know how interesting Tawapa Asabakashi can be. I grew up 40 yards away from her. You might not know this, but I also attended Turtle Island Jesuit School before I graduated from Split Rock High School. So I understand your obsession with your Indian culture." "We're not from India, Mother." It wasn't until Lily celebrated her 100th birthday that Levi even became aware he had a great-grandmother and great-uncle, Nagisi. He knew Grandma Hannah as well as all of his McPherson relatives, but his mom's heritage had caught him off guard. "You're almost the same age I was when I got pulled into this," she continued. "Now, if you're half as clever as I think you are, you already think you know everything there is to know. As a mother, I've done my best to shelter you from things, but I'm not going to be able to do that for much longer, and I wanted you to know that." "What sort of things, Mom?" Levi didn't mean to ask it so bitterly. If anything, it felt good that she was protecting him. "Good and evil are not just concepts. I've seen evil. I've seen magic. I've seen the things other people only whisper about. Your grandmother Lily held a fire in her hands as she battled real monsters. Your father and I both witnessed what happened at Carousel Island. And even back then, we knew the truce was only temporary. We thought about running away, selling the farm and never looking back at Lake Manitou. But I found my strength in Christ." Levi almost shivered at the sudden paradox within his mother. "Your great-grandmother Lily is a complicated woman, but I don't know if I can trust her. Do you remember the stories of King Solomon? The guy who asked God for wisdom?" His mom nodded grimly. "In his later years, with all of his accumulated wisdom, he turned away from God and began worshiping the gods of his wives. I worry that Lily has also lost her way. Instead of putting her faith in Jesus, she's turned to the false gods of her ancestors. She spends her waking days searching for answers in other places than the Bible. Now, remind me, Levi, what is the only way to heaven?" "No one gets to the Father except with Jesus," he repeated. "Exactly. This is a battle of good versus evil, but your only shield in the days to come will be by putting your trust and salvation in Jesus Christ. Perhaps I've assumed too much. I raised you in a Christian household and surrounded you with songs, but do you believe, Levi? Levi recoiled. Well, yeah. Father Gary said the Asante Lodge will be meeting soon with Lily in preparation of whatever. You're surrounded by people I love, but that doesn't mean you won't be tested by Satan. All of you will be tested. I'll be tested. I can't stop it from happening, so just remember what I've tried to teach you. How does my mom know more about this than I do? She reached into her pocket and handed him a cross pendant made out of barn nails. Wear this. Your Uncle Cameron made it for you. When we faced our demons back in 1962, they almost killed my big brother. He's never been the same. So go ahead, wear your shell necklaces and listen to your heavy metal music. But when the darkness comes, know where your salvation lies. When he didn't respond, she got up and went over to the dirty dishes at the sink, leaving Levi holding the cold metal of the cross pendant. Chapter 33, Time to Process. Staples, Minnesota, February 16th, 1986. Carson Looting heard a vehicle approach and looked up from his lifeless knees. He spun his wheelchair on the cold cement floor of the meat processing facility and rolled over to the black canvas tarp that hung from the ceiling. I'll check it out, Carson said to the brutal inquisitor standing between the sink and the metal tables of Western Locker. As soon as he parted the seam of the tarp, the cold, dry air bitterly greeted him. Dusk had already arrived, but the lights of the SUV were easily recognized. Forsberg had returned. Carson broke down into sobs for about 10 seconds before wiping away his tears. He didn't want to give the macho veteran another reason to judge him. The Beretta M9 pistol still rested above his crotch, still holding all 15 bullets. A yellow notepad was shoved between the side of the wheelchair and his left thigh. A chain rattled as Forsberg unlocked the doors. "Honey, I'm home," Forsberg cruelly jibed as the door opened a crack. "Fuck you," Carson answered, and then found enough callousness to play along. "How was work, dear?" "Fairly quiet for a weekend," Forsberg said, stepping through the heavy front door of the meat locker. Carson spun around again, returning to the larger processing room. The captive, Terry, hung from hooks normally used for deer, while 2 corpses rested on metal tables meant for processing the venison. Carson knew he'd likely become a vegetarian after the past 2 days, and it royally pissed him off. "What's going to happen to the kid?" "Now that I've got the boy's fingerprints, dental measurements, blood, and hair sample, I've privately arranged for him to be buried in a nice little cemetery in St. Paul." "Are you serious?" "Well, there's not going to be a public service, but the poor kid deserves a proper burial, unlike these 2 pieces of shit." "Did we get our answers?" Carson handed Forsberg the yellow notepad. For most of his 30 years of life, Carson had lived in ignorance. He didn't want to acknowledge the existence of the supernatural Wintermaker or the sinister Order of Eos. On Saturday afternoon, that all changed when a wheelchair transportation service showed up at his front door with paperwork ordered by Brian Forsberg. Seeing the transportation vans drive to his estate was a normal occurrence, but the private driver didn't bring him to the Hiawatha County Sheriff's Department. Instead, it brought him south to the small town of Staples. A mile north of town, the driver turned down a gravel road, and in a small tree break, 2 vehicles were parked in front of Western Locker, a private meat processing facility used mostly by deer hunters. In February, It was all but abandoned. The Inquisitor, who'd already been torturing a gunshot victim on Saturday afternoon, never bothered to give Carson his name, nor did Carson ask. The Inquisitor had short, thinning black hair and a wiry body. What he lacked in physical strength, his tools more than made up for. In a different nightmare, Forsberg and the Inquisitor would have made formidable monsters, and Carson had to remind himself that the men they held were the real monsters. "Save your moral outrage," Forsberg had said once Carson arrived on the scene. "I caught these guys red-handed moments after they killed that poor kid. Neither had anything to do with the Ice House murders, but they're still EOS men. I can't stay here without raising suspicions about my absence, so I'm going to need you to babysit these two. Listen. Keep notes. Ask a few questions. On Monday, I'll be burying these two bastards where they'll never be found." In 1975, after a physical therapy session at Carson's old house, Forsberg first told him about the Asante Lodge and its mission to protect Hiawatha County from the evil Order of Eos. It had done the trick. Carson came out of his depression from losing the use of his legs and became the scholar for the Asante Lodge, something that would have made his great-grandpa Albert pleased. Seeing the Inquisitor take hold of nerve endings with his surgical forceps once again changed everything for him. When Forsberg finished looking over the yellow notepad, he looked up and gave a cold nod of approval. "I suppose you'd like to go home and take a shower." "I don't think a shower's going to wash this away." "You need this. I've never seen any of the supernatural shit the others talk about, but I've known for a long time about EOS. Just like the Viet Cong sent infiltrators into villages all over South Vietnam, EOS has been sending folks out into the world as agents and spies. Lily was right about them cooking something," Brian said, glancing down at the pages of notes. "You understand now why I couldn't just haul them into jail." Carson had to wince to keep from sobbing. As a member of the Asante Lodge, he stood in for Forsberg while he was tending to his duties as sheriff. Carson nodded, clearing his throat, and said, "I understand. So now what?" "I'll call your shuttle service to come pick you up. I know the guy. He'll be discreet. I'll deal with the rest of this mess. We'll process all this information and talk to the others about it on Tuesday." Forsberg didn't answer the question. Thanks to a bit of torture, Carson knew what the enemy planned. He even had dates. On Saturday, June 21st, at the summer solstice, the Order of Eos planned to resurrect a fallen god. Chapter 34, Till Death Do Us Part. Split Rock, Minnesota, February 20th, 1986. Captain Chuck Looning woke from his nightmare with such ferocity that his wife Helen clenched a pillow in each hand to create a defensive shield. In his nightmare, he was the one being tortured from the rafters at Western Locker, and the faces of Cambodian tormentors transformed into the inky forms of the Tok Pai, whose hands peeled away patches of skin from his body. Chuck lifted his hands, acknowledging the reality of the moment. Helen, still wide-eyed, nodded and tossed the pillows aside, saying with a sigh, "I'll go make some coffee." At 48, Chuck was still in great shape despite the deep aches in his scarred body. Burn marks, bullet wounds, and scars from open fractures decorated his body from his service during the Vietnam War. His brother-in-law, former Viking Craig Redding, dealt with obesity and diabetes, which is why Chuck kept himself in such good shape. A chance encounter with Craig Redding's younger sister, Helen, during an all-American high school football camp stole Chuck's football career, sending him to the Air Force to pay for his indiscretions. Following his harrowing experience as a MIA pilot shot down in the last days of the war, Chuck returned to Split Rock in 1973, a shell of a man. Self-pity took a back seat after finding his 16-year-old son Carson in the hospital with a spinal injury after a tragic hunting accident. For the past 13 years, he and Carson rebuilt their broken bodies and relationship. His relationship with Helen was still a work in progress. He put his hands on her hips and kissed her right cheek as she stood in front of the stove, brewing the coffee. She leaned her head into his kiss, but then began reaching for cups and spoons, spinning away from him in a flurry of activity. In just his boxers and robe, he retreated to the kitchen table and sat on a cold chair. Helen moved with the precision of a chemist as she prepared 2 cups of coffee before finally sitting in a chair opposite of him. At 46, Helen had little need for working out. Her belly had a little pouch, her ass rolled a bit above the thighs, and without a bra, her breasts hung a few inches lower. But even at 5:22 a.m., she was stunning. She blew gently into the surface of her coffee, which she cradled in both hands. Unlike the dark complexion of her older brother Craig, hers was more cream, and her maternal genetics remained a mystery to this day. Mama Redding had her secrets just like her daughter did. But Chuck didn't keep anything from Helen. There's some stuff that went down this past week that you're not going to read about in the newspaper, Chuck began. A war has started and the shit's about to hit the fan. Is Carson in danger? Chuck shrugged. Probably, but we're not putting him in any obvious danger. He's more strategic. We had a meeting the other day to go over the new information we learned. Carson got his hands dirty. Helen's back arched like a cat about to hiss. What's that supposed to mean? Human sacrifices. That's the sort of people we're facing. Like the Ice House murders? Chuck nodded. Forsberg kept it out of the news this time and even managed to catch them red-handed, so to speak. Carson saw one of them die, and the other one, well, tortured. He's pretty shaken up, but he didn't have anyone to talk to but Father Gary, so, I don't know, bring him some food or something? Food? Helen recoiled. He knows which end is up. Hell, he asked for more responsibility. I'll be bringing him a plate of gozaniki this afternoon, Helen said, and then did something that surprised Chuck. How are you doing with all of this? Chuck retreated to his coffee cup for a moment, taking a few sips before looking back up at her. I had a nightmare about monsters, he began with a chuckle and a crooked grin before ending with a grimace. Killed in a flood. That's how the conversation began 13 years ago when Chuck had to explain to Helen what had happened to his grandfather and little brother. Instead of stepping up in 1962, he ran away from his duties and left for Vietnam. When he returned, his son was crippled and his wife was pregnant. Monsters? Helen repeated without judgment. What kind of monsters? The Lake Manitou kind, Chuck said, thinking of the talk pie peeling away his skin to reveal raw muscle underneath. Father Gary and McGeesey both agreed that our enemies are making human sacrifices in order to wake the ancient evil that slumbers in the lake. Lily described 12 talk pie that guarded over the Wintermaker. When the time comes, they will obey the song of their master. Until then, they are like wild dogs prowling the streets. Heck, I know what to do with rabid dogs. How do I protect Split Rock from monsters? That's a good question. What's the plan? The Order of Eos plans to act at midsummer, the summer solstice. The magic created by the arrival of Halley's Comet will still be powerful, and they plan to take the Philosopher's Stone by force and perform their own version of the Song of the Manitou ceremony. How would they know where it is? Do you remember Leonard White Elk? He'd visited them several times in the past decade, but rarely participated in conversation. The guy from the Canadian Rockies. Yeah, him. Well, he thinks whenever the water drum is used, it creates some sort of window in time. He thinks when Lily used it in 1898 and 1962, she never really closed those windows, and that they're still open. Honey, I don't understand any of that. I don't know if I'm even explaining it right, Chuck sighed with frustration. Leonard thinks that just like the windows of the past are still open, some windows in the future are also open. His theory is that the Order of Eos knows where to find the stone because they've found it in the future and then communicated back to the past. Our present? Helen clarified and then chuckled, taking a few gulps of her coffee. Oh, it is much too early to hear about all this hocus pocus talk. So, what are you going to do between now and June? Chuck hesitated for just a moment, knowing that Helen wasn't officially a member of the Asante Lodge, just like Nancy Crane hadn't been an active member either. Teen pregnancy, a shotgun wedding, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, adultery, death, and tragedy had left their marriage a complete and utter mess by 1973. But since he returned home, the fractures had become stronger bonds than what had originally held them together. Brian Forsberg, ironically, kept the family together, physically rehabbing Chuck and Carson while also counseling Helen through her relationship with her husband. The four had been sitting at the same kitchen table when Biff told them his theory about what happened to Albert and Chris in the flood, as well as the truth about the Order of Eos. It was the craziest shit any of them had ever heard, but when Forsberg finished, Helen became his partner again in sickness, and now till death do us part. What are we going to do now? Chuck repeated to give himself a bit of time. He trusted Helen with his life, even if he couldn't trust her fidelity. We're going to do a dress rehearsal of the Song of the Manitou ceremony, March 21st, which is a full moon. Apparently, even without Lily, magic is heightened on a full moon. Is it wise to do it without her? She's convinced that she's going to live until Halley's Comet passes. She talked about closing a loop around Easter. She said that once the loop is closed, she'll be able to take on the Winter Maker. On Midsummer's Eve. Chuck nodded. It's a bold plan. McGeesey is going to place a placebo, a fake, in place of the Philosopher's Stone, which will allow them to think they've found. On game day, Lily will have the real deal. She's going to let them begin the ritual to wake the Wintermaker. If they can lure him up from the depths, Lily will use the real Philosopher's Stone to take hold of him. The McGeesey is going to play the part of the Thunderbird. We'll rip the old Sorcerer from the waters and cast him into the River of Souls, which literally is the Crowing River. Quite the plan, huh? Where is this all taking place? We'll keep Lily at Turtle Island. McGeesey and the Asante Lodge will be at Bleeding Rock, which is the border of the old magic. It will be a spiritual ambush, one the Order of Eos won't see coming. By the time the dust settles, the Wintermaker will be halfway down the highway to hell, so to speak. And you think these zealots will just pout and shuffle their feet back home? Forsberg has tactical plans for the physical side of things. Trust me, the only way any of this happens is if the Order of Eos thinks it'll work. We're going to have to lay low and look away for the next few weeks, which is hard for any of us to take. Helen's eyes showed a bit of understanding as to why he'd been having nightmares again. Where will Carson be during all this insanity? He'll be with me. I'm in charge of the Bleeding Rock location, where we'll be letting McGeesey perform his exorcism ritual, for lack of a better term. It's Lily and Father Gary that will be vulnerable on Turtle Island, where it'll just be the two of them. Forsberg has his official net and also a network of mercenaries that will be backing up both locations. He also has a tactical assault unit ready for EOS. I'm beginning to understand why you want me to speak to Carson. Perhaps you should call your mother also, just to talk. Any ideas on how to keep her from coming home this summer? Kitchen fire? Let her precious Carson take the heat. We'll blame it on him and then tell her she won't be able to return until the 4th of July. Good plan, Chuck said, finishing his cup of coffee. Any advice on how to kill an immortal sorcerer? Both laughed at the absurdity. Perhaps after breakfast, Helen said, standing to collect the coffee cups. Any requests? I don't deserve you, Chuck said as she walked by him. Just keep our children safe, Helen said. Do that, and we'll talk about Worth. Chapter 35. That is the question. Golden Shores Nursing Home, February 22nd, 1986. Wally Crane only wanted to make her laugh again. Nancy's broken brain allowed her heart to beat, her lungs to breathe, her eyes to blink, and in recent weeks allowed her mouth to open and close for food. Her throat even managed a bit of vocalization, which 2 months after a stroke gave the doctors hope. As his wife sat across from him in the dining hall, it had been 2 months since he'd last heard her laugh. A simple laugh would prove she was still inside. Instead, a laugh came from across the hall. Lacey Morrison stripped off her bright yellow down jacket and hung it on the rack near the entryway, chatting pleasantly with Molly Chauvin as their conversation grew farther and farther apart. Wally looked down as he remembered seeing Molly's dead sister pulled from Lake Manitou. When he looked back up, Molly was in her office and Lacey was standing beside a table where Carson played cards. The residents perked up with each syllable she uttered, and when she smiled, they smiled. When she giggled, it was like a shot of penicillin to the infection known as old age. Wally looked down again. Like joyous thunder, the piano came to life under Lacey's fingertips, and music filled the hall. Nancy's eyes lit up. 2 songs later, Carson rolled away from the table and went to where Wally sat with his back to the frozen lake. Good morning, Mrs. Crane, Carson began, taking hold of her hand for just a minute. Do any fishing since we last spoke, Wally? Wally nodded. This is my life now. Morning visits, afternoons out on the lake. Don't you have to remove your ice house soon? Another couple weeks, but yes, spring will be here before we know it. At Carson's nod, Wally continued. Morrison girl seems to be working out. Yeah, Carson said apprehensively. She's quite a charmer. Jailbait, Wally joked, bringing a smile to Carson. That's what we call girls like that. Oh, I wish, Wally. I really wish I had those sort of problems still. Do we need to talk about problems? Carson shook his head. Nah. A moment went by. Am I really the weakest link? Everyone keeps checking in on me like I'm going to let folks down in the moment of crisis. Oh, it's not like that, Wally said. Some of us have walked this road already, and some of us haven't. To be honest with you, it might be better not to know what's coming. How could I forget about what happened in 1962? He'd seen Lily Guerin wield the Philosopher's Stone in a battle with the Takpai. Wally understood why it was called the Philosopher's Stone by Europeans. It was a football-sized rock. The white egg by the Dakota, it was smooth and white, and the water drum by the Ojibwe. It pulsed like a beating heart. When Lily Guerin placed her hands upon it, the dormant stone came to life in a swirl of earth, air, fire, water, and also spirit. In his fishing boat, he'd ferried Lily, Nicole, and Gavin to where monsters were trying to murder Cameron, Lily's grandson. He'd also seen Ed Nielsen wrestling with Takpai trying to drown him. Then and now, The fabric of the universe felt like it was about to tear apart. Minutes. That's how long the battle at Carousel Island lasted. The next day, he helped search for the body of Chris Looning after the sawmill disaster that also left his good friend Albert Fisher dead. Then Glenn Forsberg showed him where a couple of anonymous corpses were buried. The Order of Eos had almost won a victory. Even though the body of Red Dobie was never discovered, Lily and McGeesey knew how Dobie had tried to wake the Wintermaker on his own. To do it, Red Dobie had been willing to wipe out the entire community in a damn disaster. Now the Order of Eos planned to try it again. Thinking of 1962 made Wally remember those who'd been with him. Do you know if anyone has bothered checking on Cameron lately? Can Man? Is there a reason we should be worried about him? Wally shook his head. You're probably right. It has always been young people in danger. Wally could still hear the screams from Nicole, Gavin, and Cameron as they tried to survive long enough for Lily to put the talk pie back to sleep with the stone. Now, Wally and Carson watched Lacey Morrison until the towering figure of Father Gary filled the door. After dropping off his long black jacket, he strode through the hall directly to where Wally sat with his wife and Carson. Gentlemen, he said. Good morning, Mrs. Crane. Nancy only trembled in acknowledgement. Father Gary continued. I met with Levi after meeting with Nicole, and I'm going to start prepping him prior to us meeting with McGeesey. Despite appearances, he's a sweet kid. Yeah, we were just talking about kids, Carson muttered. We've got 2 schools full of potential victims we need to be protecting. But only a couple have connections to the old families of Lake Manitou, Wally added. You remember Forsberg's theories about bloodlines? I guess I should be thankful for my Ashanti blood, Carson mused. I hope I taste bad or something. Apparently, Crane blood interested the horned serpent, according to his father. With Kermit Crane's Barlow stuffed in his pocket, Wally pictured the Asante Lodge and how it would be filled in the coming ceremonies. Aja Jacques, a chieftain, his role, the son of Kermit Crane. Mang, a chieftain, Captain Chuck Looning, grandson of Pharaoh Looning. Gagoon, the intellectuals, Carson Looning, great-grandson of Albert Fisher. Mukwa, the guardian, Brian Forsberg, grandson of Bjorn Forsberg. Wabashashi, the warriors, Sakama Riel, descendant of Chippewa warriors. Benisi, the spiritual leaders. Representing the Medawiwan, McGeesey, grandson of Shagopay. Representing the Jesuits, Father Gary, filling the role of Father Garin. Wawasheshi, the gentle people, Leonard Whiteelk, son of Fawn Chavril. Wabano, the fire handler, filled by Lily herself. Others were lined up as helpers, firekeepers, guards, and assistants, and it was indeed an amicable mixture of 2 cultures. Although there were several McPherson kids, Levi was the obvious choice. He filled several roles, including the most important one, Omadai, the bait for the Wintermaker. Before the music even stopped, Lacey Morrison skipped on over, pulling out a chair to join the men. Guess what? She asked Wally, but didn't even wait. I got Nancy to speak a whole sentence the other day. The others warmed to the news faster than he did. What do you mean? Well, you know how you bought in all those books and such to read to her? Well, I saw her Hamlet book, and since we were reading it for my world literature class, I took it out. She had all sorts of notes in it, and I tried reading it, but then, pow, her teacher instincts just took over, and she mumbled out a correction. I said something wrong, and she tried to correct me. Isn't that great? Wally nodded, and Lacey took hold of his wife's hand to speak directly to her. We're going to beat this stroke, and it gets you talking again by summer, aren't we, Nancy? I think she's just trying too hard and getting frustrated, but it'll come. What did she say? Wally asked. I opened up the to be or not to be section since I know we'll get asked about it in the next weeks. And I just started reading. Well, I've known a few jerks in my life, so I was having fun reading the parts of Hamlet and Ophelia. And then, out of the blue, Nancy just blurted out, "Get thee to a nunnery." It was a bit slurred, of course, but there it was, right on the page, a few lines ahead of where I was reading. Father Gary chuckled. One of my favorite lines, but of course, used for different reasons in my profession. That's the time when Hamlet gives his girlfriend the cold shoulder because everyone is spying on him. They think he's crazy, Carson remarked. You told me you got bad grades in school, Lacey countered playfully. She said that to you? Wally interrupted. Yeah, clear as can be. Does it mean something more? It did, even though Wally's mind was now unclear. Being married to an English teacher meant getting a lecture at the drop of a hat. He knew Hamlet had a part of her curriculum, but his wife also penned a manuscript she titled Hamlet's Ghost, the story of a troubled teen trying to escape from the shadow of his tortured father. Son of a biscuit. Yeah, I think it does mean something. Wally looked into Nancy's eyes and could hear her chuckling in the past. He remembered what she'd once said to him. Did you know that Shakespeare had a son named Amleth, and that he just flipped the H to create the name Hamlet? I'm thinking about naming the main character in Hamlet's Ghost Amleth. What do you think? Stupid name, Wally had muttered in the moment, and stood up. Alarming the group with his unexplained action, he paused and turned back. Before I explain myself, I need to check something. Lacey, can I get you to bring Nancy back into the room? If you've got time, keep reading Hamlet. Carson, I'll be stopping by your place tonight. You do know your home was built with the bricks of a nunnery. Carson wrinkled his brow. I do now. Wally walked with his father Gary. Get ready for a bit of weirdness. Wally took hold of Father Gary's arm and began leading him to the door. Chapter 36, To Be or Not to Be. Staten Island, New York, February 28th, 1986. Ansel Nielsen held a bullet in his palm for so long it was warm by the time he finished saying his silent prayer. What did he save the bullet for? The puzzle was spread out over his bed, and it needed to be solved before his mother and stepfather returned from their most recent trip to Greece. The most obvious piece of the puzzle was Jimmy Nielsen's Colt Python 357 Magnum. Ansel's second favorite clue was the Polaroid of the four men standing in front of the Saigon tattoo parlor in January of 1969. They posed in olive drab fatigues while posing like frat boys around a keg, or in this case, their new instruments of death. More recently, however, Ansel focused on his father's sketches in the bound notebook. There were several of his mother Aurora, as well as the guys in his unit. The most intriguing picture to him was the drawing of a tunnel. Where the hell is this? Ansel's dreams led him to the New York City Public Library's periodical room, and on microfiche he went through the North Star News for the better part of a week, looking for clues from his father's birth in 1948 all the way to his father's suicide in 1978, when Ansel was just a kid. He found himself spellbound by the accounts of Jimmy Nielsen's 7th grade year. A child predator killed 2 local boys and almost got Jimmy's best friend Biff. The collapse of the Nicollet Dam, however, seemed the most likely explanation of the tunnel. While it certainly could have been a cave that his father drew while in the jungles of Vietnam, it most likely was part of the quarry that flooded, killing Red Dobie, Colin Fitzpatrick, Duncan Samuelson, and Craig Healy, when water poured through the dam and into the quarry. If his father's tunnel was in the quarry, it was now buried under 100 feet of water. Now on the bed, Jimmy had several printouts from the microfiche images chronicling the bizarre horrors of the spring of 1962, including how his father and Biff rescued a bus full of kids from a flooded ditch. According to the accounts, his father swam after and rescued little Molly Knutson as the raging waters threatened to pull her into a culvert. Her little sister Danica was not so fortunate. Why didn't he just go home after the war? He was a fucking hero. Ansel knew the answer to that question. While Jimmy Nielsen was a fourth-generation Minnesotan, Aurora Herman only vacationed at Lake Manitou. Her ugly small town was in Indiana. A summer fling right before boot camp resulted in Ansel's older sister, Tanya. Ansel was born 2 years after Jimmy's enlistment ended, and the whole family moved to Indiana, where they lived peacefully for 3 years, until a human monster followed Jimmy home from Vietnam. Shane Lewis returned to New Orleans after the war and then spent a few years in Los Angeles, where he met his wife Cindy. Ansel didn't know if it was childhood trauma, drug abuse, or a mental breakdown during the war, but the hulking man who stood beside Jimmy and Biff in the tattoo parlor preyed upon his entire family. Before taking his own life, Jimmy Nielsen murdered Cindy Lewis and brutally killed his former tank loader with a .357. With one bullet left in his revolver, Jimmy could have fired it into Shane's face, but Jimmy didn't fire the shot. He returned home, covered in blood, and then tossed an extension cord into the rafters to hang himself. He could have ended it quicker with that last .357 bullet, which Ansel also dreamed of doing. Ansel slipped the bullet back into the chamber. Back in 1978, Tanya had heard their father return from the murders. Ansel didn't know if she'd heard the gunshots or the door close, but she'd come rushing into his room for help. Ansel had no problem facing fear, so he walked down the hall, down the stairs, and into the garage, where he found his father hanging. Why did I do it? What kind of kid hides a murder weapon? Ansel had noticed the silver pistol and the small pool of blood beneath his father. Even though Ansel had been brave enough to face the horror of the moment, his broken brain didn't let him process his emotions properly, his shrinks later told him. Knowing his father was dead, Ansel cleaned up by taking the pistol, bringing it back to the bedroom, and hiding it inside of one of his stuffed animals for the next 7 years. Now, the mystery of Jimmy Nielsen was spread out over his bedspread. It appears as if I have 3 choices. Choice number 1 was to put the pistol into his own head and take his life. He'd certainly thought about it. The years of counseling hadn't prevented him from becoming the weirdest kid in any class and in any school his parents sent him to. His obsession with the play Hamlet in recent months sent him back to counseling after he viewed Thomas Archibald as King Claudius, his mother as Queen Gertrude, his housekeeper Emily as Polonius, and Tanya as the strung-out crazy Ophelia. Like Prince Hamlet, Ansel saw himself as the prince mourning the death of his father. In recent months, though, Ansel found himself letting go of his bitterness and instead opening his mind to the mystery of his father. Choice number 2, shoot the damn raven. While ravens were certainly all over the Northeast, there seemed to be one in particular that followed him, haunting him like Edgar Allan Poe. Ansel looked to the roof, wondering if the bird sat upon his roof or in a nearby tree, waiting, watching. Shooting it would be funny and give him closure, but it wouldn't answer the mystery of why his father had purposely left one bullet. Choice number 3, keep it for Lake Manitou. Just like his inner voice had told him to hide as a child, now his dreams told him to bring it to Lake Manitou. A literal monster waited in Minnesota. It drove his father away. It killed children. It brought down floods upon communities. If it could bleed, then perhaps his father kept the last bullet for a reason. I'll face my father's demons, and then I'll kill them. Chapter 37, Abode of the Dead. Leech Lake, Minnesota. Broken Snowshoe Moon, 1986. Lily Guerin sat in her wheelchair as the medics took away the body of Beth Roulette, who'd been her neighbor for the past 8 years. Beth had been at the supper table the previous evening, but sometime during the night, she quietly died. May your journey be swift, Lily thought, as the white sheet rolled down the hallway. She waited until Beth's body turned the corner for the front doors before she rolled back into her room. Her walls were decorated with religious artifacts from the cultures that defined her: Oceti-Sakowin, Anishinaabe, and Christian. As a child, she remembered crossing the Blue Knife River to a church that was, Methodist? It opened its doors to the native people. After attending Sacred Heart Indian School, she became Catholic, which is how her future husband, Jean Guerin, entered her life. Besides the religious artifacts, she also had numerous pictures of her family. Her only son, Louis, had died years ago, and of her 5 grandchildren, only 2 stayed home. Only Cameron visited her, despite the fact that Nicole had once been closest to her heart. The other girls left home and never looked back. Lily stopped in front of her calendar, found the marker, and crossed off another day. Her calendar read March, but her Anishinaabe culture taught it was the broken snowshoe moon, when the power of winter ended. Soon the rivers would be flowing, and like the sucker minnows, she'd also ride the currents. Her mind traveled to a distant memory 88 years earlier. Her grandfather Nanakonan sent her looking for fresh willow branches at a place he'd called Manabozo's Lodge, Turtle Island to her. Behind the island, in a crease of land, Jibe Hollow protected an ancient willow. Lily never reached the willow, but from the shore of the island, she heard an old woman's voice call out, "Granddaughter?" Having already woken the Takpai and brought down the curses upon her life, Lily had nothing to risk and conversed with the voice from the tree. The old woman promised me a cursed life. She promised that the Wintermaker would take the one thing most precious to me, my family. Yet a little time remains. I'll fulfill my promise, yet give the Wintermaker a surprise in my dying moments. In less than a month, Easter would arrive in 1986, and the final loop would close. The Takpai chased her away from the willow and the old grandmother, but Lily knew the answer to the old question. The old woman was me. 9 decades ago, she'd seen the future. At the cave where she found the Philosopher's Stone, the young woman had seen her future self alone in the canoe, wearing bright green pants and a broad-brimmed Easter hat. Levi and Joey had also been part of the vision, as well as the disfigured woman who taught her the words to the Song of the Manitou. In just a few more days, Lily's long nightmare would soon be over. And then Jean and I will be reunited. In more than one ways, young Lily had played with fire, and the adult Lily paid the painful price. 76 years ago, she lost Jean to a car accident, and since then, Lily lost even more, including her memories of his face. Like Job, once I lose everything, I'll get it all back too. Lily pushed her wheelchair away from the wall and then left her room to her favorite spot, the aviary. Granted, none of the little finches or canaries were thunderbirds, ravens, or owls, but it still felt spiritual to be in the presence of birds. She closed her eyes and simply listened to the wings and chirps. Then another distant memory entered her mind, an old plan. "Tell me about your river theory," the young bride had asked her husband. Lily had committed many sins, the worst of them involving the Wintermaker, but she'd never committed adultery with Jean. In fact, he'd officially resigned his position as priest years before they officially began courting, even though she loved him from almost the first time she'd seen him. Her visions promised her a marriage, and when Bushy Bill Morrison murdered Jean in cold blood, Lily refused to let go of the forbidden dream she'd seen. My river theory? Jean asked, looking up from whatever dense text he was reading. The River of Souls? I already know about Jibe Zibi, she said. I want you to explain to me how you think all these stories overlap. The Greeks call it Oceanus. The river carried souls down to the underworld, where it was divided into 5 separate parts. Cultures from all over the world view the underworld with water connections. Take the story of Jonah, who, as I interpret it, died by either drowning in the storm or by being swallowed by a fish. His body was being brought back to dry land, while his soul descended to what the Hebrews called Sheol, where the dead were kept. By the time of Christ, Jews views it as multifaceted, just like the Greeks. The righteous dead went to a place called Abraham's bosom, and the unrighteous were separated by a void. Throw in references to the angels being locked in an abyss, and suddenly the concept of a single underworld gets a bit complicated. Christianity has even more abstract ideas, with Christ's reference to paradise and Paul's comment about a third heaven. John smiled and shrugged. So, Lily began. His answers were often confusing. When a person dies, the soul leaves the body and begins the journey on a river. Exactly. Which is why I loved the Chippewa belief that it is a 4-day journey. Why does that matter? Look at the story of Lazarus. When Jesus learns his friend is ill, he waits. He waited on purpose. The Hebrew people, like your Chippewa people, believed that it took 3 days to travel to the gates of Sheol. Jesus waited until the 4th day to go to Lazarus, and when he arrived, everyone thought it was too late. Jesus had brought life back to recently departed, but with Lazarus, his soul had already passed by the gates of Sheol, so it seemed as if there was no coming back. He showed he was the Son of God by breaking his own rules for the spiritual universe. Is that why Jesus was dead for 3 days? Exactly. The concept of harrowing of the underworld explains that Jesus went down to the underworld, to Abraham's bosom, to gather up all the souls of the righteous dead. Of course, that's one's interpretation. Does this watery underworld still exist today? Jean chuckled. I've gotten into arguments about this with other priests. So what do you think? He moved closer to her, taking her by the hands. In the book of Revelation, chapter 20, it talks about Judgment Day, when the names found in the book of life are read. In that passage, there's a curious verse about the sea giving up the dead. What's curious about it? Well, by that point in the book of Revelation, it seems as if all the waters on earth have been eliminated by plagues and disaster, which seems to me to indicate that sea should read underworld. The underworld gave up the dead for judgment. If that is true, even if Christ has allowed some souls to go directly to heaven, where we see the souls of the saints at the altar, it might mean the old system continued collecting both the righteous and the wicked, or else what is left to judge? Lily missed Jean so much. For a decade, the two of them spent hours discussing spiritual matters. When he died outside of Mankato, she pictured his soul drifting into the Minnesota River, then into the Mississippi, and finally into the Gulf of Mexico, where it joined Oceanus. She never asked Jean about his literal interpretation of where Jonah's gates of Sheol were located, but even after burying him beside her family at Mesquite Band of Ojibwe Cemetery, she knew whether he was behind the gates of Sheol or up at heaven. She would be divided from him until the day she died. After a house fire almost took her life in 1961, she refused to return to Lake Manitou, where the souls of the dead stayed trapped. Her Lakota mother called it Wanagiata, the place of souls, which was considered a haunted place prior to the arrival of the Chippewa. Even when Jean was alive, she knew the truth about Lake Manitou, the lake of spirits. A life for a life, a soul for a soul. She held the sacred water drum in her hands. The Wintermaker held the soul of Jean Guerin. Fawn was right. I am a vile, selfish woman. The trade had been worth it. She had a decade of love. Jean gave her Louis, a child she loved with all her heart, only to have him turn against her as an adult when he learned the family's destiny. But then came the grandchildren, who again filled her heart with joy. And sweet, tender Cameron. He remained loyal to her even after becoming an adult. And the great-grandchildren, righteous young Christians, Benjamin, Leah, Reuben, and Daniel. And Levi. Bold Levi, who reminded her of her father. He waited for her in the future for decades, and now in the present, he boldly prepared to help her close the loop. And sweet Joseph, who she first knew as Clay Powabik. A hand touched her arm, and Lily flinched, opening her eyes to find herself sitting in front of the aviary with tears on her cheek. "Let's get you back to your room, too," the young native nurse said, using Lily's birth name. "I was born to Wapa Asamakashi, the spider who sat upon the water lily, guarding over Lake Manitou. I became Lily Guerin. Will there be a place for me in Sheol or heaven for the crime I am about to commit?" Chapter 38. What's in a Name? Split Rock, Minnesota, March 15th, 1986. Wally Crane stepped out of his truck and stared out at Betsy Looning's front yard. The willow seemed to stare back. In recent weeks, Wally had become a man on a mission. His sorrow and depression were gone, and he found himself gritting his teeth as he walked back to the front door of the mansion. Back in St. John, everything from the basement in the old house had been brought into the new cottage home, with 30 years of manuscripts and notes now on the dining room table. Nearly everybody in the Asante Lodge knew all about his theory involving the willow tree, but they were all too preoccupied with the coming ceremony to give it their full attention. A quick scan of the manuscript revealed an obvious oddity from Nancy. Ansel. Wally knocked on the door and waited for Carson to answer. He'd already revealed to Carson his shocking discovery. His wife had named the central protagonist in her novel, Hamlet's Ghost, in several notebooks several years before typing the first page. Carson had reacted with awe while Brian reacted with anger, which is why Wally brought his new fact to Carson. The doors unlocked, and Carson appeared in the new open doorway. "Kinda early, Wally." Wally stepped through the doorway and began to unfold the notebook paper he had crumpled in his back pocket. "Get a load of this. I went to the St. John City offices and found the oldest records they had on file. Guess what it is labeled?" "Can I get you some coffee?" Wally asked, rolling toward the kitchen. Wally followed. The drawer was labeled Makata County. Is that supposed to mean something? I think it does. Makata is the Dakota word for blue earth, like the Blue Knife River. Exactly. We both know who came to Minnesota looking for blue vitriol. Joseph Nicollet, Carson commented. And the Order of Eos, most likely the men who killed him. The Makata County drawer was dated 1849, which was a few years before Minnesota officially became a state. And by that time, we had the current names, but at one time, we were in Makata County. "Any toast or anything?" Carson continued as he poured a little vodka into his orange juice. "Thanks to Father Guerin, we have his theory that the Philosopher's Stone was once in the Haunted Valley, dug up by Pierre Charles Lesueur, lost, and then showed up in Chippewa hands here at Lake Manitou. Left alone, The Philosopher's Stone turns anything around it into a strange blue earth, Carson interrupted, squinting. Okay, I'm listening now, Wally. What's your point? I left it to Brian to contact Aurora out in New York. That Ansel kid? Our missing Asante Lodge member? Wally nodded. We'll have to see if she can explain how he ended up with the name Ansel, but I couldn't find any way that Nancy could have given it to either Jimmy or Aurora. So I went searching for an explanation on why Nancy or the Nielsen's used the name Ansel. And I found it. Ansel Township. It's halfway between Nimrod and Pine River. It's just empty fields. It has a population of under 100 people. I went out there, and I didn't see signs indicating the boundary. Another coincidence? Ah. But why was it named Ansel Township? That's how the rabbit hole sent me to the Makata file folder in the Hiawatha County records. The county clerk, Nathan Iverson, wrote that Ansel Township's name came from, and I quote, the first explorer to Hiawatha County. Huh, Carson said, swigging down his orange juice. First explorer, huh? LeSueur and Lahontan came out to the Haunted Valley in the 1680s, and some Radisson and Grosselos found the Dakota on the shores of Lake Superior in the 1950s. So, when did this Ansel cat come to Hiawatha County? Who the hell is this Ansel character? And now you've caught up with my morning, Wally said, sitting at the chair out of a kitchen table. His head spun, surprised he'd remembered all the details to share. After a moment, he finished his point. Who the hell is Ansel? I'll speak with Brian, but if he doesn't make any progress on contacting the kid, I'll call Alexandra Nielsen. I think she's still living in Granite Falls. Do you remember her married name? Molitor. Wayne Molitor. Well, now that we've gotten our strange fact of the day, are we all set for our clandestine meeting of the Asante Lodge on Wednesday? Carson asked. Leonard White Elk arrived on Saturday with his nephew and are staying in Brainerd. Sacamariel is out at the MBO with McGeesey. We rented a big cabin out on Sugar Point, so Lily will only have to make a short drive. Yes, I think we're finally set. And Levi? I'm going to visit Gavin and Nicole right after I leave here. To be honest with you, they're both scared shitless. I worry they could do something stupid at the last minute. Well, they've got good reason to be scared, don't they? Wally nodded and acknowledged the knot in his gut. He'd seen the Takpai back in 1962. We all have reason to be scared shitless. Chapter 39, Wendigo Moon. Split Rock, Minnesota, March 21st, 1986. The kid is hiding something, Brian Forsberg decided by the time they climbed into his SUV. Something's just not right. Parting took longer than anyone had planned, and as they all stepped out of the lodge, dusk had already arrived, and with it, the full moon. Wally Crane took the elbow of Lily as they entered the muddy parking lot and walked toward the old GMC truck. Chuck Looning tended to Carson. Father Mackenzie escorted McGeesey, and Leonard White Elk chatted with his nephew Ben Labiche and Sacamariel of Turtle Island Jesuit School. Drive safely, Wally Crane shouted out after shutting Lily in the passenger seat of the cab. They'll be safer than anyone realizes, and Brian thought as they neared his SUV. 6 off-duty deputies earned a Franklin each for sitting in a perimeter around Leech Lake, and another $100 for following each vehicle home. The kid looked over at Forsberg slyly before they parted to walk around the SUV. When Brian sat down, Levi was ready with another question. You don't believe any of this, do you? Brian turned the key in the ignition. Belief has nothing to do with it. Levi glanced down for a few seconds, waiting for him to turn the SUV around before beginning driving. Everybody else in the Asante Lodge had a brush with the supernatural. The Loonings both have dreams and premonitions. Leonard White Elk and Ben Labiche have conversed with the spirits of the dead. Father Mackenzie has witnessed exorcisms. McGeesey had his soul ripped from his living body and dragged into Lake Manitou. Wally saw Gigi Lilly fight the Tokpai at Carousel Island. You didn't share a single story before we practiced the ritual. What's your point? Forsberg asked as he turned onto County Road 39. Levi chuckled. If Lily is right, the future of humanity is on the line here. We've got a once-in-a-generation chance to fight evil, and if we screw up, we can end up dooming the entire world. Everybody else looked terrified for most of the day as we ran through the ritual. Like I admitted, I checked off most of those boxes. Dreams, ghostly encounters, strange omens, and even the Tokpai. But you just sat there with your arms crossed for most of the day. I worry you're the weakest link that I've seen in all those horror movies. Are you going to be our fellowship's Boromir? Oh, fuck you. Brian let out an incredulous guffaw instead of unleashing cruelty. Then he counted to 10 as he shook his head and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Everybody talked about the importance of the Omidai in the ritual, yet Levi just sat there like a grinning Cheshire cat during all of it, not having a single phrase or verse to add. Sure, McGeesey and Lilly explained the concept of the Omidai as bait, but Forsberg also noticed how White Elk, Labiche, and Riel all wrinkled their brows during the explanation. And the kid singles me out? Forsberg pulled off the winding lake access road and onto the open highway of County Road 8. I'm going to tell you an old tale told by your people. I might be white and freckled, but I've also spent decades of my life reading legends and lore while you spent a few months reading about it between chemistry and algebra. Take it easy on him. He took a deep breath. There's a creature called the Wendigo. The giant cannibals, Levi began, but an icy glare from Brian shut him up quickly. Yes, the story about the cannibal monster. As you know, the tales of this creature describe some zombie, werewolf, vampire-like creature that prowls the deep woods, feasting on the flesh of men. But what they don't focus on is the origin of the Wendigo. The Wendigo began as an ordinary man, a guy with a mom and a dad and sisters and Gigi's, just like you and I. Somewhere along the line, this guy crossed a line. Your Ojibwe ancestors talked about the sin being cannibalism, like the same shit that purportedly happened on Madeline Island a few centuries ago. But it's not just cannibalism. I've seen the Wendigo dozens of times. I've seen ordinary men transform into monsters. Do you understand me? Levi nodded flippantly. Do you? I've seen more death than any other member of the Asante Lodge, and yeah, I haven't seen the supernatural crap. I've seen real-life monsters, and when I looked in their eyes, I didn't see humans. I've hunted the Wendigos in the pines of Minnesota, the jungles of Vietnam, and the mountains of Nepal. I know monsters, kid. The wry smile finally left Levi's face as they drove south to Lake Manitou. The setting sun hid both of them in the darkness of the SUV cab. It wasn't until they reached Pine River at the northeast corner of Hiawatha County that Brian found a new line of conversation. I promised your folks to keep you safe, so I don't want any secrets between the two of us. Is that understood? I understand. I know what happened to McGeesey back in 1898, and I know what happened in 1962. I'll keep a good eye on Daniel and Joey, too. It's good to know you've got my back. My mom pretty much hates everybody, but she thinks the world of you. Something's up with the kid. He's holding back. Brian pictured the old deer stand, where he and the other kids gathered to make sense of the strange things happening to them in 1962. Back then, Nicky Guerin had been open-minded enough to sing the spells given to her by her brother Cameron from Lily. A few days later, when the bus accident happened, he and Jimmy Nielsen dove right into the deadly floodwaters to save all but one kid. Shortly after that, when the Tokpai attacked, the same spell protected Nicky, Gavin, and Cameron. Chris Looning had been late to the meeting and died. Neither young Biff nor now balding Brian understood what any of the words meant that Nicky had sung in the treehouse, but he knew the spell had worked. What he didn't know was the expiration date of the spell. Today, Lily talked about the magic of her old spells waning and how the full moon and comet would bring the balance in Lake Manitou. He did have belief. He just didn't know if it would be enough. Levi sat up. Brian saw it also. The SUV had driven through Split Rock and was descending Old Copper Road. At the bottom of the incline, on the platform of the bridge, sat a large black raven. Brian studied the kid rather than the bird. He's nervous about a bird? Something wrong? That's a big bird, Levi said, trying to hide his interest. The raven showed no interest in moving, and Brian found his fingers touching the hilt of his pistol. Is there something you want to tell me? Maybe it's a good omen, Levi said, noticing he had stiffened. Should I get out? Brian passed the horn. The big wings extended and held, a sign it wasn't going to back down. But then with two quick flaps, the bird vanished into the darkness. Brian lost sight of the bird, but when his eyes returned to the cab, Levi was still looking for it. So, that's what the kid's hiding. It's something about the raven.